Good evening. I'd very much like to welcome you all to this live streaming event with myself, David Sidwick, the Police and Crime Commissioner for Dorset, and our Chief Constable, Scott Chilton. So the purpose of tonight is the Chief and I will be doing a short presentation each discussing where we are, what progress has been made, and then we're going to take as many questions as possible. Some of those will be on the screen live, and some we've had sent in advance. So firstly, where are we? Well, it's a year on since I became Police and Crime Commissioner. Those of you who know me may remember that I got grumpy about some of the things which affect the people of Dorset. Things like problems with reporting, things like antisocial behaviour, issues around things like shoplifting. So I've spent 3 years full-time campaigning. And on May the 6th last year, I had the honour and privilege to become the PCC. Now, part of that 3 years was to understand what the PCC does, and also to understand what the people of Dorset wanted. So there was a lot of engagement, 50 meetings before COVID, countless Teams meetings, 3 surveys. And it was very clear that people of Dorset wanted Dorset to be the safest county. And I put together a manifesto which fitted with that. Coming into office, that became a 100-day plan, and then a police and crime plan, which was delivered 6 months early. So what were those priorities? Well, I'm going to go through them and pick on 1 or 2 elements within them. One was to cut crime and antisocial behaviour. Now, prior to me becoming the PCC, that wasn't a priority. It is now through Operation Relentless. And something I'd just like to touch on tonight is I started an Operation Relentless Community Fund, which we ran last year, for communities and charities to ask for funding for between £100 and £5,000 in order to address antisocial behaviour. We were able to help 10 locations across Dorset with that. Today, we're now relaunching the Operation Relentless Community Fund, so that is now open again for communities and charities to basically come forward and ask for grants in order to address antisocial behaviour. The second priority was to make policing more visible and connected. Part of that is resource. So part of it is having more police officers around in our communities. And I was very clear that's where they needed to be. And of the first tranche of uplift, 44 out of 50, that's exactly where they are in our communities. But it's also about a cultural change. We need more engagement. We need to see our police officers around. We need to have them visible in our communities. Priority 3 was about the violence in our communities, the drugs which bring that, and the hidden harms. So things like, for example, violence against women and girls, domestic abuse, stalking, child sexual abuse, and modern slavery. And there I'm just going to pick on 2 things. One is there is now a regional way of addressing the drugs. The PCCs for the Southwest have come together to make it a priority to create a hostile environment for drug dealers and antisocial drug takers. And with Operation Scorpion, what's happening is we're putting a ring of steel around the Southwest. And then we have a local way of dealing with county lines, which is new, which is Operation Viper. And I'm not going to steal the Chief's thunder. The Chief will talk about that when he speaks in a minute. Priority 4 was around rural crime. And I was very aware that we had 2/3 very good members of the rural crime team, but that was nowhere near enough. Other forces in the country had far more. So I was very clear that we needed to invest in the rural crime team. And the rural crime team covers not just rural crime, but also wildlife crime and heritage crime. And you'll hear a bit more about that later. And there was a couple of threads that ran through all of this. The first is putting victims and communities first, to make certain that everybody gets the victim support that they need, and that communities basically are given the support that they need going forward. And we've got to do all this with the resources we have. So the last priority is about making every penny counts. And I see clearly that is about lobbying upwards for more funding. You will have heard that Dorset does not get a fair shake regarding funding. It is about making certain that Dorset Police make every penny counts for us. And it is about, with the precept, making certain it is clear and transparent what that will be getting for you, the people of Dorset. So very clearly, those were the manifesto commitments, but they also translated into the plan. That's your plan. It's what the people at Dorset said that they wanted. It's in plain English, and it gives a consistency of purpose for the next 7 years. And that's important because that allows us to do the things that we can affect immediately, but it also allows us to make certain that we make the long-term changes, things about addiction, things about our young people, some of which are great, but some who do fall into antisocial behavior and county lines. So we've got this thread, we've got this connection now from the people of Dorset and what they need, through myself as the Police and Crime Commissioner, through the Police and Crime Plan. And now we've got the other piece of the puzzle with the new Chief Constable, who now has put together an operational plan. And now what we've got to do is we've got to deliver. So we're well on the way, we're making good progress, and we're going to talk a bit about that as we go through the questions. And I'll hand over to Scott Chilton in order to talk about it from his end and the operational end.
Okay, thank you, Commissioner. Good evening, everybody. Thank you for joining us. It's important that we share the work that we're doing, but also we allow plenty of time for the questions today, because I know that's incredibly important that we hear you and we respond and we listen. I'll just take a very short time and then we can get on to the questions. So what the Police and Crime Commissioner has done there is given the voice of the people in terms of delivering a police and crime plan. And there's one thing that we absolutely have in common, which is that we want this county to be the safest place. We want to be tough on crime, and we want to provide the level of intervention and action that you expect to see from your police force. But importantly, we need to make sure that we respond and we put victims as our priority. So since being appointed as your Chief Constable, which was August of last year, and this is now my 30th year in policing, I've now had plenty of opportunity to review what the force was doing, take into account the police and crime plan, and then try and deliver a type of policing that is affordable, but absolutely is targeted for the things that matter to the residents of Dorset. And some of the things will come out in the discussions that we're going to be talking about. But what does it mean when you say you're tough on crime? What does it mean when you put victims first? We can't wave a magic wand and we can't make it all happen overnight. But the police force is around, the purpose is absolutely about being responsive to the public. Now, I'd be the first to acknowledge that we have got some challenges around meeting the level of demand set against the amount of resources that we've got. But it's my job to try and allocate and prioritise those in the right areas. And that's not all about just pure threat, harm and risk. It's about making sure we deliver a service for everybody. Some of the things that we've done since being in the last year, we've got a real strong approach to county lines drug dealing. We've increased our ability to be able to deliver more enforcement tactics. So we have neighbourhood enforcement teams now based locally in neighbourhoods, targeting those drug gangs, those drug dealers that are actually causing misery to the communities, that are targeting the vulnerable and often seeking to get our young people involved in drug supply. That won't happen in Dorset. We won't allow it to happen. So the launch of Operation Viper was following the investment that we've put in a far stronger, more robust, proactive capability within Dorset. The Police and Crime Commissioner mentioned relentless, our approach to antisocial behaviour. It'd be too strong a line to say zero tolerance, but I do have an expectation that my officers and staff are far tougher when tackling antisocial behaviour, and we've seen some really promising and significant results in a short space of time by making that a priority for the force. And that could manifest itself in different ways in different parts of our county. But our police force will no longer be passive to it, but accepts that sometimes we won't be able to respond straight away. But antisocial behaviour is a priority, whereas previously it wasn't before. Greater visibility across the communities of Dorset. We've got an uplift programme with an increase of officers coming into the force. Not all of them are here yet. We'll be putting those in the places where they have the greatest effect. And also I will be making sure that we've got all of the officers that were what some people say back office functions, they're reallocated to the front end, so people see that difference, and they see that difference within their neighbourhood teams and also the specialist units that we have out there tackling some of our more serious crimes. The Police and Crime Commission mentioned rural. I've done a root and branch of what our commitment review of what our commitment is to rural policing, and improvements were needed to be made. I've travelled the size of the rural team. We'll perhaps talk about that later on. But I recognise fully that there was a feeling in some parts of the community that we weren't visible enough and present enough, and absolutely that is not the case, and that remains a priority. One of the things I've done is change the operating model of the force. So actually we're looking at where we put the resources. Some of that work is still in train. We've got some more work to do, and we've got to invest in the new types of technology to make ourselves more accessible to people. But it's the first time for a long while that Dorset's actually looked at where its officers are, what are they doing, do they actually meet that 24/7, 365 days a year demand in an agile way. So a programme of work really looking at our operating model. But the real focus absolutely needs to be on that relentless pursuit of criminals. There are a small number of people that cause the most harm. And when you look at it and you analyse that data, you look at the individuals involved. We need to work across the whole criminal justice system and with our partners to try and prevent those crimes happening in the first place, but take a real strong view when we do and try and get these people before the courts. And so that tough on crime message really does need to land. It's been a really tough period coming out of COVID. Society's pent up need to get out there and socialise and enjoy themselves sometimes has manifested itself in certain behaviours that have caused increased demand upon policing. That's a reality. The levels of demand that have come through since last year have been significant for the police service to be able to absorb. But with the plans that we've got in place, the operational plan that the Police and Crime Commission talks about, I'm confident that we'll actually make the improvements that our communities are talking about. But I'm going to leave it there, and we'll take some questions. So back to you, David, to talk us through the next piece.
Absolutely. Thank you, Chief Constable. So I think what we'll do is we'll go to the first live question that we've got. Can I ask for it to be put up? Right. This is from Dan Short. Is there any updates on the antisocial behaviour going on in Poole bus station? So that's a very operational one. I'm going to hand that to you, Chief, if you've got any updates on that. If not, then we'll come back to it afterwards and respond to it separately. We're going to do that with every question. If we don't have the actual data here, we'll come back to you.
I mean, there's a short and a long answer to that. The long answer is a very detailed one, and it's right for the local police commander to do it. I have been briefed in detail about Poole bus station. I'm aware of the partnership that work's been going on there, and I realise that the situation isn't resolved. The police have a role, so do other agencies. And we're working really hard to try and do it. But I recognise that has become a real problem. It's the antisocial behaviour commitment that we've made that needs to be resolved. We can get a very specific one. I know there's been a lot of press around it. I mean, it would be a very long answer to it, but I've briefed on Poole bus station every single month. But what we'll do is we'll supply a more detailed answer to the gentleman that raised that question.
No, I think that's absolutely right, and I'm very clear that that's one of the areas that have to be addressed, and I'm talking to partners about that sort of thing generally from a strategic end as to what more we can do for our young people in order to basically fix the future, if I can put it that way. So absolutely, it's a complicated issue, and yeah, we'll get that long answer to you. So can I have the next one, please? Okay, what is Dorset Police stats for response times compared to the stats covered on the BBC News this evening? So the BBC News said a 20 to 40% reduction in response times. That must be nationally then, in that case. This is from Joanna Jones. Chief.
The issue over, I think we're talking about response in, are we talking about response in relation to picking up the phone when people phone Travel 9, or are we talking about deployment? I mean, because there's a different answer to that question. So
I think what we'll do is I think because they were talking about deployment this morning, I think let's talk about it from that end.
Yeah. So if we're talking about,
I get the concern of people around that.
Yeah. So if we're talking about in terms of the speed of which Travel 9 calls are answered, is an incredibly complex issue in the way that some of the data is measured. But you know, our figures for the last year show 85% of calls are answered within 10 seconds. We did have a blip in April. We're now back to, answering calls within 14 seconds. There will be times that there are additional delays, evenings and at night time when there's increased traffic and people contacting us. One thing we do recognise is how important it is for us to be able to treat and deal with emergencies, and 999 is absolutely the right thing to do. There are so many people that contact 999 that shouldn't be contacting 999 with issues that are not emergencies, and they stop our call handlers being able to speak to those people that really do need us. There is also an increase in traffic in terms of 999 coming through our systems, where it's demand, from people that perhaps are unwell and not getting the support in terms of mental health provision, in terms of supporting the community that would, that again is causing some of those delays. But there is nothing more important to me than making sure that our call handling system recognises when people need us, they can contact us and we will deploy quickly. We've invested and put a very senior officer in charge of a whole new programme of work looking at how we receive calls and contact into the organisation, whether it be online, 101, 999, because we recognise that some of our technology isn't quick enough in being able to identify what we need to prioritise and how effectively we'll be able to deploy. I've escalated this issue in terms of having personal oversight of it, and that actually is going to be a really significant piece of work. So you've got to look beyond the data around the complexity, but do not for one moment underestimate how important I recognise it is when people call us and they really need us, that we will. But again, members of the public constantly calling 999 when it's not emergency is unhelpful.
So thank you for that. I'm aware of the amount of investment which we are making certain goes into that area to make certain that is optimized for the future. I think it's important to discuss the deployment as well, because that was the issue which was highlighted on the news this morning, was the issue around 999 calls. And I appreciate that the examples which were used were very much not from Dorset, but I think we need to understand, particularly for the residents, what are we doing about deployment? How is that working? Yeah. What are our times? So if we can do that piece as well, please.
Yeah, no, thanks. So I mean, just by way of explanation, we have about 1,000 calls or contacts a day into Dorset Police. About 600 of those are then become recorded incidents, some of which require police attendance, some of which don't. And there's about 150 crimes recorded a day. So you can see there's a lot of issues that are raised with the police that isn't crime, that perhaps is best suited to another agency dealing with. However, the important thing is that we effectively triage those. So we assess there. So there will be times when we've got to ask questions on the phone to identify, with the limited resources that we have available at a certain time, whether an immediate deployment is necessary. And we also need to recognise that actually sometimes deploying a neighbourhood officer to follow up with a scheduled appointment will be the more effective way of dealing with it. Or if we can actually help by providing information through our online systems, because often people need direction support or signposting to the right organisation. We have made mistakes in the past, and I acknowledge that we haven't deployed when we should have done. And that's why the programme that I talked about earlier, which is the effective triage, identifying what needs deployment straight away, and then making sure that we've got the larger proportion of officers on at the time when the public need us is really important. And that's the programme of work that I've talked about, because I want to make those improvements and I want to really make a difference to those communities. But there will be times when the service is under significant pressure that we simply cannot deploy, but it will be done on a prioritisation basis.
Thank you. I'm going to take one of the, no, I'm not. I'm going to take another live question then in that case. Are the police still recruiting? If so, when are those extra officers like to be seen on the streets? You've already said that there will be more, from Sue Froud. So from my perspective, the police are still recruiting. It's something that I scrutinise and monitor on a monthly basis. But for the detail, I'll let the Chief Constable answer.
So thank you. Yes, and I'm delighted that we are. We nationally, there's been an uplift programme of 20,000 police officers. To put things into context, that's about 168 officers for Dorset over 3 years. That doesn't mean we only recruit 168, because there are people that leave the service. So we're constantly recruiting. In doing so, obviously, we lose a lot of experience, people at the experience end, and we're recruiting new recruits. That program, to make them, the program of recruitment, training, and tutoring, can take 2 to 3 years before they're fully effective. And there are some challenges that we're going to have a very young workforce moving forwards, and we need to make sure they're fit and they're ready and they're fully equipped and trained and ready for the tough job that they've got. We will continue recruiting for the end of that uplift program. My ambition that I am discussing with the Police and Crime Commissioner is to try and continue recruiting over and above that uplift program, but we've got to drive out every single penny that can be better spent on frontline policing, and that's my challenge, and those are the sort of the detail that I'll be talking through with the Police and Crime Commission. It's a joint ambition that we do that. In terms of where are they, well, the first 40 or 50 are out there absolutely in frontline policing. The year 2 uplift, they're starting now to come out of training. They are predominantly within neighbourhood teams and response teams. And the 3rd year, we're just in effect working out that detail now, so we don't need to do it. There will be we don't need to go through that process now, because I haven't got the detail. There is an increase in areas of crime that we've got: increased cybercrime, serious sexual assault, hate crime, domestic abuse, increase in numbers of missing people. These are all issues that we need to deal with and address. So my intention is to put as many of those officers on the front line as possible, but there are occasions where it makes entire sense that some of those people are working in those specialist units to try and reduce the demand and make sure that we give the best service. So, for example, you can't come out of training and suddenly be an expert in dealing with, an awful rape situation and putting that all the way through the criminal justice system. If we've got an increase in reporting of things like rape and domestic abuse, of which is encouraging because it means people are telling about these awful crimes, then I need to make sure I've got the necessary skilled, trained and experienced officers to do it. So there's a little bit of movement, but the absolute lion's share of those people are in neighbourhood enforcement teams, tackling the county lines drug gangs, tackling the antisocial behaviour, embedded in those neighbourhood teams, in those communities. But we need to work through the detail around what it will look like in the year 3 of uplift. And for any of you out there who are considering a career in policing, please do look at our website, consider a career with us.
Thank you. Listen, I'll endorse that last comment. I also want to make the point about specials as well. We're looking for people, and the more people, the better. So from Councillor Byron Quayle, how can local parish town councils help support the police to make their communities safer? So this is really to the core of about getting better connection between the neighbourhood policing teams and the areas in which they serve. The chief will know that we spent 3 hours, I think, embedding the issues around engagement early in the year as part of the transformation piece going forward. And it's really about where we go next. So, for example, if I can talk briefly, for the parishes, there is a rural crime board, which we have instigated. And we're looking at what we can do in order to increase the watch capability in parish councils. The idea being is if there isn't a local police officer actually in that village, then we can actually address it and have a closer connection. So that's one of the ways, is for the parish councils to support that process, and we'll be talking more about that going forward. I'm going to shut up now and let the chief talk from that perspective as well.
I haven't got the original question up. Can we get that? It was Brian, wasn't it?
It was it was Councillor Byron Cole, and it was how could parish councils / town councils support their police? Okay,
thanks, Byron. I mean, it is a great question and incredibly welcome. I since I've been working here as Chief Constable in Dorset, I have been absolutely amazed and delighted at the the way in which parish councils want to support policing and support communities, and that's really, really evident. And I'm grateful for all of the work they do in terms of making premises available, in understanding local issues for my neighbourhood officers. And it really is that. I mean, in some respects, it's about building that relationship. It's about making sure that we share information, and there'll be members of the community that, you know, have really strong relationship with parish councillors, with parish councils, and there'll be very local issues that I want my neighbourhood officers to be dealing with. And similarly, I want my neighbourhood officers to be communicating the type of work that we're doing, because often much of what we do goes unseen. David mentioned earlier around, you know, special constables. I'll just use that as an example. You know, I'm really keen that we have people who want perhaps volunteer and support, you know, that are minded to support, that they can actually, you know, be a special constable within a parish or within a community where they feel as though they're giving back to their community. So building up that community spirit, some of the great stuff that we saw coming out of the difficulties of COVID in terms of community cohesion, the police are absolutely central to that. So for me, it's about how we can support young people, how we share information together, how we tell you what we're doing, but also take the views from the communities through the parish councils, and how we can be present to make sure that we actually communicate some of the great work that's going on, and explain some of the sort of you know, challenges and opportunities to do with policing. But we're privileged in Dorset to have such great parish councils that want to work with us and are asking sort of questions that Byron's just asked. So thank you.
Yeah, brilliant question. Okay, can we have the next one? Okay, this is from Caro McAdam. Dorset is a beautiful county, rich in wildlife, which should be protected to benefit all of us. Why has the Rural Wildlife Crime Team been renamed the Rural Crime Team? And why has PC Claire Dinsdale, who has won awards for her work on wildlife crime, been told that she will be deployed elsewhere? Okay, so let me sort of talk about this a little bit. The Rural Crime Team, as far as I'm concerned, has from day one, when I became a Police and Crime Commissioner, had the remit to cover rural crime, wildlife crime, and heritage crime. That has never changed. And in fact, going from 2 or 3 people in the Rural Crime Team, we have absolutely invested heavily in order to address that. And those people all do those 3 things: rural crime, wildlife crime, and heritage crime. Now, it is completely inappropriate for me to discuss any individual officers. I'm going to hand that one over to Scott, but over to you, Chief.
Okay. There's been an awful lot of confusion, miscommunication, whatever you want to describe it, around the Rural Crime Team. And statements have been put out from myself and the Police and Crime Commissioner fairly recently around this. The reality is I've trebled the size of the Rural Crime Team since being appointed, following discussions way at the start of, you know, upon appointment with the Police and Crime Commissioner. Absolute clear commitment within the Police and Crime Plan to invest and strengthen our service to rural teams. So I've trebled the size of the Rural Crime Team. The changing the name from what it was has caused confusion. It's a nonsense. There is no change of strategy. It's always been about tackling, you know, heritage crime, wildlife crime. We've invested in terms of developing a new strategy. You'll have seen some of the social media around the brilliant work that team do, and a belief that we are taking it less serious is to be honest, based on what I don't know. It's ill-founded and it's not true. It's quite the opposite. And I've got a fair amount of experience of this in another force, and we've taken some of the learning from that and made sure that actually we get there quicker in terms of that additional investment and that additional requirement that we need. Rural crime is very, very important to our communities of Dorset, and that's reflected both in the Police and Crime Plan and the operational plan that's been put in place to support it, and that's with people, not just words. In relation to the officer, I don't usually talk about officers. It'd be inappropriate to do it. But PC Dinsdale is a brilliant officer. and quite rightly has been applauded for all of her fantastic efforts. She's very much part of the rural crime team. Where this notion is that she's been removed from the rural crime team, I do not know. I won't go into any more detailed about individual officers, but again, it's nonsense. So I couldn't be clearer on it. My commitment to rural crime is about investing in more people, a new strategy, working with the Police and Crime Commissioner in terms of delivering against the commitment. There's a new Police and Crime Board. We've only just spent 2 hours this morning with the Police and Crime Commissioner talking about how we get increased visibility in rural communities, some of the plans that we've got in place, because we're so intent on making a difference to those communities that feel as though the level of policing that they've got has been lacking in this area. And that's, you know, for me is very much includes wildlife crime, heritage crime. And I want Dorset to be one of the very, very best in the country in this area. I don't want to be criticised for not delivering against it when I'm not seeing that. So it will take some time for those things to actually manifest themselves in the results that we all hope for. But we should be working together on this. And as we have done in the rural crime team, I applaud the efforts that they've done in the progress that they've made.
Thank you, Chief. And in a not unrelated question, Alex Bugler has asked, what happened to the investigation into the poisoned eagle?
Want me to answer that, Dave?
Well, I think so. I think that's most appropriate, it being an operational investigation.
So, Alex, firstly, thank you for asking the question. I know how important it's been, and I know how many people have commented upon this particular investigation. I've written numerous letters, and my staff have trying to articulate where we were at with it. So the report came in of the death of the bird, and it was investigated. The investigation took place, and it found that there was insufficient evidence to meet any sort of test with the Crown Prosecution Service that a successful prosecution was possible. It was even to the extent they couldn't establish whether a crime had happened in Dorset around it. Having received some complaints around it, I asked my Assistant Chief Constable to instruct a senior detective to review that investigation, and that has happened. And the conclusion has been drawn that it was a proportionate investigation. There were no outstanding lines of inquiry, and there was no information naming any individual in relation to it. There were allegations, suggestions made that there was some sort of political interference as a result of that investigation. Again, that is absolutely not true in relation to what happened. No bearing whatsoever. And the police, without fear or favour, conduct a proportionate investigation. So the investigation, you know, if there is additional information, we will look at that, we will review it. There are differences of opinion about it, I accept that, but there are also a lot of inaccuracies being reported regarding it. The investigation as it stands at the moment has been closed. Additional information comes forward, we will review it and we will look at it. But it was appropriate, it's been reviewed by a senior detective with an oversight of one of my Assistant Chief Constables, and absolutely some of the suggestions that the investigation wasn't conducted and the investigation was closed for reasons that I've just articulated are not true.
And I'd just like to echo that. From the point of view of a Police and Crime Commissioner, you take an oath to preserve the operational independence of the police force. So actually, whether an investigation is opened or closed is absolutely outside the remit of a PCC. So I would echo the point that there was nothing, absolutely nothing, no credibility to that whatsoever. Okay, so any updates on, I presume that's county lines in Poole. This is from Michael Holland. You will know, Chief, how intent I am about basically driving drugs out of our county, and county lines is one of the most insidious things that we've got going. Do you want to give an update on Operation Viper?
Yeah. So recently we launched Operation Viper, but for months before that, we've been working at investing additional resources into ensuring that the spread of county lines will not just curtailed but smashed, and that is the intention. My experience of policing and working in other areas is you need to be all over this. There are very clear examples of some of the larger metropolitan areas across the country having county lines operating from Birmingham, Manchester, Liverpool, London, for example, across the whole country, and Dorset is not unaffected by that. And that involves actually the county lines being run from those areas, but people operating in our communities. And what comes with that is often significant violence and targeting of vulnerable people whose houses are often cuckooed and taken over in order to be used for drug dealing to take place. The Police and Crime Commissioner was clear in what he said, and I absolutely echo that. Our commitment to disrupting county lines will be unwavering. We've committed the additional resources through the neighbour enforcement teams. I've also created a county lines task force that have the responsibility for developing all of those intelligence and working with those other police forces, in effect the net importers of county lines into our communities, and making sure that our children and our residents are protected, and it won't happen. There are some real successes that the force has had on this. We're really starting to see that disruption, but it needs to be relentless and it needs to be continued. And that's what we will do. And that very much is at the fore of my mind. I'll deploy any of our capabilities, any of our specialist assets and any of our numbers to make sure that we absolutely make sure that Dorset isn't a place where county line drug dealers can come and not expect to have a very, very tough response.
So a question for me from Sydney Turner. Have you ever complained or criticised Dorset Police? Sydney, you're not in the meetings I'm in every week. We have robust discussions. One particular area where I am pretty critical about Dorset Police is the issue around 101, 999 customer contact. I use the phrase customer service, which we need absolutely to be at the forefront of what we do. It's an oil tanker. We're nowhere near where we should be yet. The chief knows this. We've talked about it. We have plans. If you're asking me the question, do I go in the press every 5 minutes and give Dorset Police a good kicking? No, I don't. My job is to scrutinise and move the. In my view, my job is to scrutinise the Dorset Police and make certain they're delivering against the police and crime plan, which is for the people of Dorset, and that's what I do. So when things go wrong, yes, I do criticise and yes, I do complain. Any comment, Chief?
Well, I'm on the receiving end of it. I know that because you know. The Police and Crime Commissioner does challenge, robust in terms of scrutiny, quite rightfully makes my life tough, but I recognise how the force is progressing and sort of things that I need to be able to deliver against the police and crime plan. There are conversations that we have that we don't agree on, and there are conversations that are had that we do agree on, and that's the reality of you know, a relationship and a working relationship between an operationally independent chief constable and a police and crime commissioner that represents the people. So you know, if anyone was a fly on the wall in terms of my working week, they would see the police and crime commissioner absolutely is challenging where he needs to be.
Brilliant, thank you. So I've got a question from Margaret Phipps, Councillor Margaret Phipps in Christchurch. Can I ask a question about your priorities, please? I think they're not working for the typical Dorset resident. So yeah, I'm not quite certain what the question is there, but if we unpick the priorities for a moment, the first thing to me, are they relevant? Well, as I said right at the start, those are the priorities that the people of Dorset said to me they wanted from the point of view of going forward. They're very clear priorities. There's nowhere to hide with those. They are not, they're not public service speak. They're not deliberately vague. They are very clear. And that's the way it needs to be. So the first thing is the priorities actually come from the people. So I'm a bit confused about the question. If you're asking, have they all been achieved? No. We are a year in of a 3-year term, which, by the way, is the least any PCC will have to make a difference because of COVID. But we're making good progress. I mean, if we were going to talk about cutting crime and antisocial behaviour, I've seen parts of Dorset where there's been a 30% reduction in antisocial behaviour. I've seen figures for the Q3 where we've had a 15% reduction in antisocial behaviour outside of COVID. So it's moving in the right direction. If we're talking about making the police more visible and connected, that's one of the hardest things that we need to do because there are so many elements there. One element is the contact, which we've talked about a bit, and we're putting much more investment in that direction. It is an absolute tragedy that the previous administration did not move quicker with something called single online home. We're one of the last forces in the country to have that. And that's a web-based mechanism which helps reduce demand, but we will have that. I signed off on it in the autumn. So we are moving forward. You've heard about the uplift. That is now beginning to start being embedded. Fighting violent crime and high harm. How can that not be a priority for a police and crime commissioner? And you've heard the situation with, we're now able to have Operation Scorpion across the region, which we couldn't have before. We've now got Operation Viper, which we didn't have before. Fighting rural crime. How can that not be a priority? There was a token gesture with 2 to 3 officers before. We've now trebled that in the first year. Putting victims and communities first. How can you argue with that? And making every penny count for Dorset. So I'm a little bit bewildered as to why those priorities don't fit with the residents of Dorset. I hope I've answered that comprehensively enough. Thank you for that. Mandy Potter. Why don't you take the public seriously when I phoned the police 4 times about antisocial behaviour on a Friday night in Wareham? The police only came out once, promised us patrols on a Friday, but nothing. I think that that's something which we need to look at and we need to basically take forward. I'm going to let the chief answer that as it's so specific and operational.
Thanks, Mandy, for your question. I obviously haven't got the detail and can't answer specifics about your situation. I wouldn't disagree with you. I mean, it comes back to the earlier point around, the availability of officers to respond to when it's got other emergencies going on. And it may not, and I'm not saying your case wasn't for one moment, but it may not have actually been the priority at that particular time. But actually, what sits within your question is repeated antisocial behaviour. We've made a commitment around antisocial behaviour. My expectation is, with my local sergeants and inspectors and neighbourhood teams, that they target those hotspots and listen to communities and follow up on those type of calls. So, I can't answer specific questions around it, but that is exactly why it's a priority. It's exactly why the resources that we're getting come into to the force need to be allocated to the right areas. Sometimes, though, those reports of antisocial behaviour are not best led by the police, because that is a response to a problem that has occurred. It needs to be working with schools. It needs to be parents taking their responsibility seriously in terms of making sure that their children are out on the streets causing problems. It's working with local authority, partnership agencies to divert young people away from it. But I do entirely accept the point. If you're a victim of antisocial behaviour where you felt it necessary to contact people 4 times, that is no way acceptable, and that's absolutely why we need to be improving in that particular area. I mean, one of the difficulties we have with antisocial behaviour when we do it, it's a very broad description. It means many things to different people. I was just looking when the commissioner was then talking about some of the progress against the plan. I mean, antisocial behaviour since 1920 we've brought down by 7.5%, even though we've had a significant increase in demand. And and reducing areas. I'm not going to go through them and do it, but antisocial behaviour, that, you know, there are now new crime types that never existed before. You know, there are things that we have to record in terms of our data that previously would have been dealt with by an officer just going and having a word with people, and a strong word with them, taking them back to their parents. That's the sort of policing that I want in Dorset. Old school coppering with common sense, and common sense needs to prevail rather than it's getting tied up in bureaucracy and process. And this is the oil tanker that I want to turn around and make sure that my officers go out there and just apply common sense and deal with issues and not overcomplicate things. And that will actually release some time and some capacity for people to be able to respond to those problems. The investment in neighbourhood teams is exactly there to tackle the problems that came upon that last question. So if we've let you down in those circumstances, then it's right to call us out and we need to improve on it.
Okay, so we've got Carol Robson. How do you police rural areas? Never see police in the village despite having crime. So this goes to exactly what we've been talking about from the point of view of the uplift, having more police officers in our communities, and the increase in the rural crime team. But specifically, Scott, you take that one?
Yeah. Can we can't get a question up again, can we?
There it is.
Thank you. I know that there's the reality of crime and the fear of crime, and the two are interlinked. And there are, you know, one of the first things that I noticed when I became chief constable in terms of the approach was that there was insufficient coverage. I mean, there is a reality to it. There are simply not enough police officers and PCSOs to be out there covering every village regularly in the way that we would all like. It's a fact that there simply isn't. But there is stuff that we should do, and you should know who your neighbourhood officer is, and you should be able to contact your neighbourhood officer and discuss a particular problem. We know we get hit with people, you know, crossing the border and targeting isolated premises. We know businesses are affected, and we know that crimes do happen. One of the things that we were actually talking about earlier on today was exactly this point. How do we provide visibility to rural communities? Now, we know that we can't provide police stations everywhere, and we can't provide dedicated resources, and we can't dedicate resources to every village in the same way that we would have done all the sort of numbers that we would have done. But there are things we can do about telling you how you contact your police officer. At what point will they turn up in your village and be available for you to be able to discuss those problems? And do you know when it is? Can we get out there with our sort of, mobile police stations and presence to make ourselves far more accessible? It's really important. I know we've got difficulties with 101 that we do continue to report those crimes, because then we can make informed decisions around actually how we allocate resources. But there's also a belief that police officers are just about neighbourhood policing. There isn't. We've got armed response vehicles out there. We have road policing resources. We have specialist officers out there doing other inquiries. And I do accept that if you're in a more remote location, you are less likely to see it. It's a very, very difficult challenge, but as you can see, the priority, we've talked about rural policing, how we need to improve, and we've talked about the importance of working with communities to know and understand what's going on together. And one of the things that the commissioner I know is looking at, and I'm speaking to other chief constables about, is particularly on the fringes of our county, how do we work more effectively with other forces to make sure we provide that hostile place, those rings of steel, those operations where we know we have people coming into those areas committing crime, and actually we're on top of it. And that includes things like fly tipping. It includes unlawful encampments. It includes rural premises being targeted for burglary where plant machinery is stolen. And those type of offences. So, we are an incredibly safe county, but that doesn't mean we can't be safer. And it doesn't mean that we shouldn't actually invest in those additional resources that we've talked about to make sure that all residents of Dorset are kept safe, not just those in the dense areas where the very serious crimes are happening regularly.
Thank you. So here's an interesting comment. Adrian Barnes, who's obviously a motorbiker. Motorbike theft is on the rise in Dorset. What are your plans for combating the thefts? So that's interesting. I didn't know it was on the rise. Do you want to comment on that, Chief?
Well, I wasn't aware that it had been on the rise to and that maybe I need to apologise for. That data hasn't come through in relation to it. That doesn't mean we're not doing anything about it, and it's not an incredibly important thing. I need to take that away, Adrian. Really have a look at that, and I really thank you for raising it, because if that is the case, as you know, there are things that we can do in terms of prevention. There are things often when people are stealing, particularly the sort of more expensive machines. It's often organised crime, and we should be developing our intelligence regarding that, but also working with the public to try and help them make sure that they keep their motorbikes safe. And I need to take that one away and have a look at it, because I will be frank, that's not an issue that's found its way to me at the moment. But thank you for raising it.
Okay. Okay, so this is from Christine James. It's a question about cannabis, basically. Why keep ignoring my complaints regarding weed smokers, which is a drug? So fed up with this everywhere you go in Weymouth, it stinks. Get a grip on it. So there's going to be the piece about the operational piece, but I'd like to make a couple of points about this. We talked earlier about enforcement. We talked about Operation Scorpion, Operation Viper, and what the police are doing around the enforcement in this space. And that absolutely needs to happen. But there's a couple of other things. One, we need much better rehabilitation for people who are addicted. But we also need impactful education. I mean, there is more and more evidence coming out that cannabis has health risks, which we didn't know before, leaving aside the mental health risks. And I'm actually talking in London to MPs about this specific issue in the next couple of weeks. We need to actually have a much more coordinated educational stroke awareness campaign about those risks in order to try and help people understand why it's not a good thing to do. But there's a specific question about Weymouth and a specific question about the smell and that sort of thing. So I'll hand that over to you, Chief.
I agree. I find it disgusting, and I know people will have their views about whether cannabis should be legalised, whether it should be. I apply the law, and at the moment, people smoking weed in public in the way that it's been described is not acceptable. I regularly, when I speak to officers and I get myself around the county, reinforce exactly that point. I expect you to be dealing with it, and I expect my neighbourhood officers and all my officers, when they see that happening, to deal with it. Now, what our response is has to be proportionate, because I can't clog up the criminal justice system in terms of prosecutions every time. But there are things that we can do, and there are interventions that need to take place. At what point people felt it was acceptable to walk down the street smoking a spliff as though it doesn't matter and people are passive around, I don't know. I certainly concur with your view. I'll continue to reinforce that point. There is a broader societal view on these things. I don't want to get drawn into that, because either whatever my opinion is, it won't work for some people. But in terms of the law and the police, when we talk about antisocial behaviour, using drugs in public is antisocial behaviour. So I agree, and I will absolutely continue to reinforce that. And it's right and proper question to ask. And I will be asking some more questions of my police commander in Weymouth about particularly what they're doing down there in relation to that particular aspect.
Thank you, Chief. Absolutely spot on. Neither of us get to legislate, so that's not within our gift. All I can do is scrutinise and make certain that you and your police officers uphold the law. So well done. Next question, please. Joanna Charlize Jones. Antisocial behaviour on Sandbanks Beach is consistently bad at night, and yet the council award an off licence on the beach kiosk to 11 p.m, now reduced to 9 p.m. thanks to Beach Hut Association complaints. But why is there so little collaboration, police and BCP? Okay. So again, that's very specific. It's about antisocial behaviour. It does talk to something, though, which I'm very keen about, and which I've instituted monthly meetings at a strategic level with BCP at the highest level. And that's one of the things that we talk about is antisocial behaviour, particularly in regards to the summer. But that's a specific issue around, looks like a off licence. Scott, got any comments?
I mean, again, that's one for the police commander for BCP would have the detail. I wouldn't have that. I would dispute we don't have a good relationship with BCP Council. We have a very good relationship. I'm aware of the regular meetings they have. I do see the priorities that come through, and I've seen the joint working. I'm not saying there isn't more that can be done, and there are other agencies involved in that. The neighbourhood teams, absolutely, that is their role, to tackle the sort of antisocial behaviour that's being referred to in those areas. I think we've come a long way in the last couple of years in terms of making sure that the public sector works more effectively together, and we've got more that can be done. In relation to issuing of licensing for off licence, that's not a police decision. But if there are complaints and there's evidence of antisocial behaviour, all of that is taken into account, and we do have an input in it. But we can again, take that specific incident and perhaps get back with a little bit more detail on that point, because I don't have the information at hand.
Okay. So very clearly, we've dealt with a great number of topics this evening. I am sorry for those who were disappointed because they had questions and we didn't get to them. We will be doing this again. We will try and answer as many questions as possible offline as well. I just want to thank all the people who basically attended and came and saw and heard of the work that's being done. I'd like to thank the people who asked the questions. There were some very good questions there, some very challenging questions. Questions which I hope allowed us to illuminate what is being done. And obviously, you've heard the priorities in the police and crime plan. You've heard there's an operational plan in order to deliver on those. We are going to keep on pounding away to make certain that we turn this oil tanker. And we'll do another one of these either later in the year or next year. And I will be doing my individual ones going forward, so you can ask me specific questions. So I'd like to thank everybody who's basically attended. I'd like to thank the Chief Constable for making time and coming and also putting himself up, same as me. And I wish you all very well for an evening, and hopefully have fun. Cheers then.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you.